A long time ago, over 15 years ago, my father passed away. May he rest in peace and be granted mercy. We went to the cemetery, which was very far from our homes, in an isolated mountain area. I was among those who went for the burial to bid farewell to my father. After the burial was over and everything was finished, everyone returned except for me. Despite their sincere attempts to take me back with them, I refused and chose to stay by my father's side. I stayed, reciting the Quran beside him. My father was the dearest person to my heart. He filled my life with love, being both a loyal friend and a wise, compassionate father. I couldn't bear the shock of his departure, or the thought of him being alone under the earth, far from me. I was still young back then, and this was the first death I'd experienced in my life. I remember feeling as if something in my mind had gone awry. I couldn't grasp what had happened. My eyes, too, never stopped shedding tears, not even for a single moment. I remember that I was in a state of utter despair that day. Everyone in my family tried to convince me to return with them. Some even attempted to stay with me to keep me company, but I adamantly refused. Their repeated words were that it wasn't wise to stay alone in the cemetery, especially at night in the dark. Their faces grew more and more frightened as they talked about how the cemetery is a place everyone dreads, and they were shocked at my insistence on staying there alone at night. With my insistence, everyone eventually left, and I remained by my father's grave, reciting what I had memorized from the Quran, all thanks to him, as he had always encouraged me to memorize the entire Quran. Suddenly, as I read, tears flowing from the pain of separation, I heard a sound coming from within the grave. I approached, getting closer and closer, until I pressed my ear to the grave itself. Could it possibly be my father's voice? I cried out for the cemetery keeper, who didn't hesitate to come rushing to me. I asked him, my voice trembling with evident fear, if he could hear a sound like the one I was hearing. He answered, looking worried for me, that he couldn't hear anything. He didn't leave me alone. He stayed with me and escorted me back home. I was convinced that I had heard a sound from my father's grave, a sound that resembled screaming, as if someone was calling for help. When I returned, I went to my uncle and asked him, "Did my father really die, Uncle? Are you sure he passed away? What if he went into a coma and we buried him alive in a dark grave?" My uncle was taken aback by my question and explained that my father had been in an accident. Despite resuscitating him and performing multiple surgeries, he never regained consciousness. He spent nearly a month unconscious, and when he passed, his heart, brain, and all bodily functions had stopped. How could we have buried him alive? Something inside me still insisted that my father was alive, that these screams were cries for help from him. So the next day, I went to the cemetery again and stayed there, reciting the Quran and praying for God to have mercy on him, until I didn't realize how dark it had become. I only noticed when I heard the same screams. I approached the source of the sound, getting closer, until I discovered that the sound was coming from the grave next to my father's. I tried to read the name on the grave, only to find it oddly scratched out. I rushed to the cemetery keeper and described the grave in the way the name was scratched out. I asked him who it belonged to and when the person had been buried. I confessed how disturbing the sounds I had heard over 2 consecutive days from this eerie grave were. The cemetery keeper's answer was like a thunderbolt to my heart. He told me, "Son, didn't I warn you about staying alone in the cemetery, especially at night? Don't get involved in their world, for their world is not like ours. But despite that, I'll tell you to calm your heart. This grave belongs to an old woman who, during her life, was a witch and sorceress who knew nothing but harm, hurt, and dealings with evil jinn servants. Since she was buried, all I hear are terrifying screams from her grave, but I never interfere. Her name was scratched off in the way you saw, by someone she had harmed during her life. I left the cemetery and have never returned since. Strangely enough, the old woman's screams still haunt me from time to time, even to this day. I work as an architect at one of the major companies in the country. Since graduating from university, I was able to secure this position because I graduated with distinction, which is rare. During my 5 years of work, I made some good friends, but my closest friends are Kareem and Ahmed. We got used to going to and from work together, even traveling together whenever we had a project outside the city. One day, the company informed me that I would have to travel to a distant city to oversee a project that would be completed in 12 days. My job, along with my friend, was to ensure that all architectural plans were executed accurately. As usual, I prepared with Ahmed and Kareem to travel to the city and finish the work as quickly as possible, so I could return home. We went, and when we arrived, we found something no one could have imagined. Near the project site were residential buildings where we were supposed to stay. The strange thing was that all the apartments in all the buildings were occupied by workers and engineers, except for one building which had no residents at all. This building was right next to a large cemetery, although Kareem was against the idea of staying in one of the apartments in that building. We had no other choice. "Where else will we go now, Kareem?" I asked him. Of course, Kareem couldn't answer this question, so we headed directly to that building and chose apartment number 5 on the 3rd floor. The apartment looked ordinary, with nothing to raise suspicion. Each of us chose a room, and we sat down for dinner and then went to sleep. At 4 in the morning, something strange happened to Kareem. Suddenly, without warning, he started screaming loudly. We rushed to him and I asked, "Kareem, what's wrong? What happened?" Kareem replied, "I saw a terrifying creature in my dream, staring at me from afar and threatening to cut off my head." I said to him, "Don't worry, Kareem. It's just a nightmare. Let's pray Fajr, and the nightmares will go away, God willing." Ahmed suggested, "We should read the Quran regularly, as we don't know what exactly Kareem saw in his dream." I said to Ahmed, "That's a good idea, but for now, let's go pray Fajr." So we all prayed Fajr, and then went back to sleep for a bit before going to work. The workday was exhausting, and when we returned to the apartment, we had lunch, and each of us went to rest. What happened to Kareem also happened to Ahmed. Ahmed woke me up, terrified, saying, "Muhammad, there's something wrong with this apartment. I saw a creature staring at me from afar and threatening to kill me, and then it disappeared." I asked Ahmed to describe the creature. He said, "Its face was black, with eyes as red as blood, and it had horns. In its hand, it had large claws, and it held an axe dripping with blood. It was a terrifying sight." I went with Ahmed to check on Kareem, but he didn't answer. His door was tightly closed. We assumed he was just deeply asleep. An hour passed, and Kareem still hadn't woken up, so we began calling out to him and banging on the door, but there was no response. We became extremely worried about our friend, so we decided to break down the door. We entered the room, only to be shocked. Kareem was not in his room. How could this happen when we saw him with our own eyes, entering the room and closing the door? Thus began our search for our friend Kareem. We searched the entire apartment, but couldn't find him. We went outside and searched the entire building. When we reached the roof, we saw something that froze the blood in our veins. There was a trail of blood, as if a blood-soaked body had been dragged along the ground. We followed the blood, and then came the shocking sight. Our friend Kareem's headless body lay before us. We were horrified at the sight, and at that moment we knew the apartment was haunted. We didn't know what to do, so we immediately notified the police in our company. Within minutes, the place was filled with police officers. A group of locals had gathered, and they didn't seem surprised by what had happened to Kareem. We asked one of the locals, and his answer shocked us. He told us that the apartment we had chosen was once inhabited by a sorcerer who used to summon jinn to carry out his magic. But he eventually repented to God, so the jinn beheaded him. Ahmed and I decided to return to our homes and never travel again, no matter what.